welcome to episode number 35 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
This week, we are talking to you. Part 2. Actually, we talk to you every week, but this week you're talking to us and we're talking back. It's been a while since our last Q&A episode, but the questions have been coming in, and on today's show we'll be answering 5 questions sent in by you or people somewhat like you. The 5 questions we're hitting this week: what are all these advanced network settings for the Mac OS system preferences? What's up with spam that seems to come from somebody I know? Not me, but now you get the idea. Web of Trust, is it any good? File Vault clarification. What's the difference between the recovery key and the password, and do I actually have to write down the recovery key? And finally, how smart is Time Machine when it comes to optimized storage? Now, I want to say one thing before we get into today's show. Nicholas and Nicholas are great about answering listener questions. We don't just wait, to answer them when we get a Q&A. If you have a question or a concern that you think the guys might be able to help with, or something you want to let them know about, send it in. It's checklist@securemac.com is the address. Checklist@securemac.com. And don't worry, we will be giving that address again at the end of the show. Before that, though, the show. Corey wrote in to ask for more information on how to set up the network settings, specifically the fields under the Advanced button. This would be TCP/IP, DNS, WINS, 802.1x, proxies, and hardware. What does all of that mean? And Corey is asking that, but I could certainly use the answer as well. What does all that mean, and are there safe ways to configure these fields?
Well, setting up a computer on a network used to be a bit tricky, but Apple has worked hard to make the process as seamless as possible in macOS. Most of the time, you don't need to do anything more advanced than select your Wi-Fi network from the airport menu and enter the password. That's it. You're connected to the internet. Now, that being said, there are some more advanced network settings and options available in macOS for situations where the defaults aren't enough. All of these settings are found by opening the system preferences on your Mac, clicking the network icon, selecting your active network connection from the list on the left-hand side of that screen. That'll usually be Wi-Fi these days. And then clicking the Advanced button. So let's go through what each of these optional network settings are. The first tab is Wi-Fi. Now, this will only show up if you're working with a Wi-Fi connection. This screen gives some options, such as setting up preferred networks and locking down some of the Wi-Fi functionality. It can be helpful in situations where you have multiple Wi-Fi base stations due to poor reception, as your Mac will try to connect to your preferred networks in the order you specify. You can actually, once you set more than a couple of them, you can drag the order of the network, so it will try and connect to whichever one's at the top of the list first, and then the next one down. In my situation here, we have really, really, really poor reception, and I actually have two routers. I don't have 2 Apple ones, so I can't do the nice mesh networking there. But I have one that's like the downstairs router and one that's upstairs, and basically I have to specify on my Mac that it should prefer to do the upstairs network. It can get a signal from the downstairs one, but it's like 1 bar. The downside is that the iPhone doesn't seem to be smart enough to know which one it should connect to. It always tries to do the downstairs one when I'm upstairs, and vice versa. So, not perfect on the iPhone, but on the Mac it's pretty good. Some of the other options on there are security options, which are useful if you have kids and want to make sure they're not messing around with the Wi-Fi settings. You can basically stop them from being able to change what network it's connected to without an administrator password, or stop them from turning on or off Wi-Fi. All those things that kids would do to try and get on the internet when they're not supposed to. Next up is the TCP/IP tab, which is where you will find information on your computer's IP address as well as your router's IP address. I believe we mentioned it a long time ago. IP addresses are Internet Protocol addresses, which is a numerical address that all the networks and computers and everything else use to identify your machine on a network or a website on a network. It's a way of telling each computer apart. This can be useful, having that information can be useful when you're trying to get various devices on your home network to talk to each other. Most of the time, you can leave the settings on this screen alone. Sometimes it's necessary to manually enter the information, but that's one of those things where it's one of those you'll know it when you see it. Somebody will tell you that you have to be doing it that way, or network administrator will tell you have to set it up manually, but otherwise just leave it alone. Your Mac is pretty smart and will be able to take care of itself. The next tab over is DNS, and this actually is one you might want to change. We've discussed DNS on the show before, same with IP addresses that we just mentioned. DNS is basically the equivalent of a phone book for the internet. It helps match up those numerical IP addresses, which we just talked about, with for a website, for example, with the plain text URL, such as apple.com, that we're all familiar with. By default, your Mac will use the DNS servers provided by your internet service provider. But there are some reasons and some times that you might want to change to different DNS servers. Sometimes, for example, ISPs will have network problems that prevent you from accessing websites. Sometimes the entire service network is down and there's no way you're getting online until they fix it. But other times they're just having problems with their DNS servers. Your internet connection itself still works just fine. It just doesn't know how to get to from apple.com that you're entering in your address bar in your browser to the actual numerical IP address that Apple site resides at. Other times, ISPs will use something called DNS redirection to inject ad content onto sites you're trying to visit. Most of the time, you'll see this when a website doesn't exist because you mistyped the address. If you're on a DNS server that isn't injecting ads, it'll just say 404 not found, which is the web code saying this doesn't exist, or you can't reach server, or whatever your I guess whatever your browser will display. Some of them display the text differently. But if your ISP is injecting ads, you might see an advertisement instead. Sometimes they are nice and they try and redirect you to what they think you wanted to go to, but and then also some shadier ISPs will actually replace legitimate ads on normal websites with their own ads. So those are a few different reasons you might want to switch from your ISP's default DNS servers. One option would be to switch over to Google's public DNS servers. They're fast and often a good alternative if your ISP is experiencing problems with their own DNS servers. Now, thankfully, it's pretty easy to remember the addresses for Google's public DNS servers, which are 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.4.4. You can switch to Google's public DNS servers by clicking the plus button on the DNS settings screen and entering those addresses one at a time. So on one line you'd have 8.8.8.8, and the next line it would be 8.8.4.4. And then you'll be using Google's DNS servers. Again, you're not going to be having the ad redirects. Sometimes it's faster than your ISPs. It's great when your ISP is having problems. So that, again, is one that you might want to change. The next setting tab is Wins, which is used for networking in a Microsoft Windows environment. This screen is really useful if you want to find out the name of your computer as it would appear on a computer running Windows on the same network. So if you're trying to get file sharing working between two systems, what you have your Mac, in the previous episode when we talked about file sharing, your computer name that you set on that screen is usually a bit different than how it would appear from a Windows machine on the same network. So this is where you'd be able to change that name. Normally, again, not anything you need to change on this screen unless you're in a primarily like Windows environment network and you have a systems administrator saying, hey, you need to change your Windows network settings. So again, normally nothing to worry about. The next screen is 802.1x. The name might sound familiar to the various 802.11 standards for Wi-Fi connections, and that's because it also has to do with Wi-Fi. 802.1x is a standard that's designed to enhance the security of local area networks. The setup and configuration of 802.1x would be done by a system administrator and is usually found in corporate network environments. So you don't need to worry about setting anything up here. If you need an 802.1x profile because it's required by your corporate policy, your system administrator will provide you with one to use. Next up is proxies. In some network situations, it's necessary to route your internet traffic through a proxy server in order to access some internet sites. This would usually occur in situations with more advanced firewall setups, such as those found, once again, in a corporate network environment. So, once again, unless you know what you're doing, you shouldn't enable any proxy services on your Mac. Doing so when you don't know what you're doing can actually pose a security threat, because then you're routing all of your internet traffic through another computer. And if that's some random computer, that's not a good thing. Finally, there's the hardware tab. This tab provides information on your actual network hardware. So either the Wi-Fi network card in your computer, or depending on how old your computer is, the Ethernet network card. Sometimes you'll need information from this screen, such as your MAC address, especially if you've configured your network to only allow traffic from whitelisted MAC addresses. This is a way that you can lock down your network to only work for computers that you specifically allowed. Occasionally, some networking problems can also be solved by adjusting some of the settings to values other than defaults, but most of the time, leaving things alone should work fine. So again, that's it for all those advanced network settings in macOS. 99% of the time, you don't need to change any of the settings. About the only ones you'd ever need to even think about changing would be the preferred Wi-Fi network setting and the DNS server setting. It's better to leave the rest alone unless absolutely necessary.
Something that people actually might want to concern themselves a bit more with, or maybe they're just forced to concern themselves with it because, it comes to them automatically. Question about spam that seems to come from somebody you know. Question number 2 for today's checklist. Dennis writes in, I get an email from someone I know. There are half a dozen on the to list, and sometimes I recognize them. The content of the message is something short like, look what I found on the internet, followed by a URL. Of course, the message is not from the source it seems to be, but the to list does seem to be taken from the address book of the purported source. Somehow the address book has been compromised and the spammer is sending messages to the contacts pretending to be the owner. This seems to happen over and over. How are address books getting stolen so commonly?
Well, when it comes to spam, we're all pretty familiar with the generic stuff. Some prince in a foreign country needs our help moving the extra millions he just happens to have laying around. Sometimes, however, we receive an email from someone we know, and we might even see other people on the list that we know in the CC field. But something just seems off about the email. The writing style is different, or the person just provided a link to some random-looking website, or included a strange attachment, all of which should be setting off your alarm bells. Disguising spam to appear from someone we know is a tactic used by spammers to increase the chance that their targets will open the spam message, then click the link or download and run the attachment, both of which usually lead to malware. So, where do the bad guys get this legitimate-looking address book information from? Well, hack computers, email accounts, websites. If a user ends up installing malware used by spammers, the malware will usually look for the victim's address book and immediately start spamming everybody in it. Other times, if a website is hacked and has information on its users stolen by the bad guys, they'll get email addresses and connections between various users from that information, which they'll use to attempt that targeted form of spamming we mentioned earlier. Finally, if someone's email account is hacked, either through malware, phishing, or password reuse, the bad guys will do the same thing there. Grab their address books and spam the heck out of all of their contacts. As Dennis pointed out, this is very common. It's actually exceedingly common and is one of the most basic tactics used by spammers and hackers to spread their junk to as many people as possible. Now, there's not much you can do to avoid receiving these type of emails as they're coming from one of your friends who got hacked, but it would be nice to let your friend know that they received the spam and that they should probably change their password and run an anti-malware scan on their computer. I've seen so many cases where this has happened, and friends of friends who are in that CC list will then contact everybody else on the list going, hey, you got hacked. Hey, you got spammed. Oh, that happened like half a year ago or a year ago. And these people are still using that same contact information and address. All that stuff gets reused over and over, even though that person may have changed their password or fixed whatever security problem they have.
And once the bad guys have those address books and contact lists, they either reuse themselves or they sell or trade them to other spammers. So again, this can be a continuing thing. Even if the original people who hacked the account or the original spammers are long gone, somebody else might have that information, and the trend continues.
You could help avoid falling victim to address book theft yourself by being careful with the links that you click on and the files you download from these type of emails, and practice general safe computing habits while surfing the web.
And if you're wondering what those are, may I direct you to episodes 1 through 34 of the checklist? Because there's probably some stuff actually specific to that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but, I gave the email address earlier. I'll give the website as well. It is securemac.com/checklist. Securemac.com/checklist for some of those safe surfing habits, for some of those, I'm sure we've done shows on spam and phishing and all kinds of things before. Well, not phishing specifically, but that's one that's coming up soon. Anyway, I'll give you all that information again later as well. So stand by, because you'll get the web address again. You'll get the email address again. But right now, we got more questions to get to. Bob B. wrote in with a question on browser security. See, this episode even has security questions and answers. Kind of amazing. For quite some time, I've been using a browser plugin called Web of Trust on a PC and on a Mac, writes Bob. When I Google, I see colored circles beside the suggested website. Green is good, yellow is caution, and red is avoid. Do you see any benefit or risk with this plugin?
Web of Trust is a great concept and can definitely help determine the trustworthiness of websites you visit, and was one that was highly recommended for a long time. However, the trustworthiness of the plugin itself has been called into question recently. Back in November 2016, a German television channel investigated Web of Trust and found that they've been collecting, analyzing, and selling information about the browsing habits of their users to third parties. This information included mailing addresses, travel plans, possible health issues, or anything else those users Googled for, and more. Now, as if that wasn't bad enough, Web of Trust apparently wasn't doing a great job of properly anonymizing the data, which meant that those third parties could potentially use it to identify an individual user and their browsing habits. So, bottom line, while the core concept of Web of Trust is great, due to their lax views on user privacy, we have to recommend that you pass this one up. Along a similar line of, I guess a tool that people knew and trusted in the news very recently, as of this recording, there was a company called UnrollMe, which was it is a service to help users manage subscription emails, so newsletters or those sales, coupons, whatever. It will kind of aggregate them into one giant digest email, and it also helps you unsubscribe from ones you don't want to be on anymore. It's pretty great. Actually, I've recommended it in the past to people. It turns out that the company that owns them has been collecting data from those users. It's all in the privacy policy, so it was the thing, again, nobody ever reads those. But basically, they would collect data and resell it. And in this case, they were collecting, in the case that they got a lot of bad press for, was they were collecting passenger receipts from people who used Lyft and selling those receipts to Uber for Uber to figure out how healthy of a company Lyft was, how good they were doing with their sales. So,
but they're anonymizing the data, right? I mean,
It's
anonymous. It's not like they know Nick took Lyft on this date, right?
Yes, supposedly, without being able to see their server side of things, you can't tell for sure. The way Unroll Me works is you have to give them access to your inbox, so they can see all your emails that you've sent or received and then do whatever they're doing with them. And you're trusting that they're not doing anything bad. Kind of like with Web of Trust. With the browser plugin, you're giving Web of Trust access to see all of the websites you're visiting. And you're trusting that they won't do something bad with that data. And we've talked about on the show before how, especially with social networks, stuff like that, if you're not paying for a product, you are the product. Your browsing habits are the product. Your habits and likes and dislikes, all that stuff's being sold to advertisers. Kind of the unfortunate truth about the world. But again, some really good examples of why it's very important to try and slog through those really dense privacy policies for all these companies out there.
Do me a favor, though, if you could, because I remember Slice Intelligence was part of this story as well. Which part were they?
I believe they own Unroll Me now. They bought them out a couple of years ago, and Slice is the one who aggregates the data and resells it. Because
that's what Slice does. I mean, that's their business model.
Exactly, and that's I think the anger here from users was that the relationship between Slice and Unroll Me wasn't exactly clear on the website, and the only spot that's mentioned the we're going to resell your data was really deep in the privacy policy. Like the frequently asked questions had no information on that. The website says we're here to basically help you cut down on spam and ads and clean up your inbox. And so users weren't whether naively or not, they weren't expecting their data to be used that way. So it was a breach of trust in that regard. It wasn't anything that wasn't in their privacy policy.
But man, don't you expect everybody to resell your data nowadays, especially using these free type services? I mean, there's the idea that you're protected and it's for the little guy out there, but everybody seems to be doing it more and more.
Especially because the free services, it's kind of you get what you pay for.
Well, let's back up a tiny bit, though, because when I said that's Slice's business model, that is not Slice's business model as far as the consumer is concerned. If memory serves, what Slice actually does for the consumer is it helps them it takes all of their emailed receipts from different businesses and organizes them for the consumer. Which, okay, if you're the kind of person who wants that kind of thing done automatically, that's great. The reason I know about Slice is because they're usually one of the first people to come out with, hey, here's how many of this Apple sold over the opening weekend. Because, of course, Apple doesn't give those kind of numbers anymore. But what Slice does is it goes through and it says, oh, here's a receipt for the brand new iPhone. Let's put that in the pile of receipts for the brand new iPhone. And then at the end of the weekend, they'll say Apple probably sold about this many based on the receipts that we're getting from this. Now, it's not telling me that Nicholas bought that, but it's saying, okay, one of these people did that. And so on some level, I think users of the Slice service may know that kind of thing is going on. The two problems, I suppose, would be if you don't know that Slice owns Unroll Me and that's one of their business plans or one of their ways of doing business or one of the things that they do with that data. And the other thing, I guess, would be if you're on something like Unroll Me because you don't want your information out there, then it's a betrayal of trust. If, on the other hand, you're on Unroll Me because you like Inbox Zero, and that's difficult because of the 100 coupon codes you're getting every day from, whichever random business you happen to have given your email to at some point. I mean, it's an incredibly multi-layered problem, although it's like I said recently on something else. Each layer of an onion is still an onion. So, I mean, if you don't like it, the next layer down, you're not going to like a whole lot more. That's a really weird question about Unroll Me, though, especially once you throw in the Slice information.
Mm-hmm.
Well, something to think about as we move on to our next question. This one comes from Paul. He was a fan of our episode on safeguarding data with backups and encryption. And he wrote in to say that episode inspired him to encrypt both the hard disk and the Time Machine backup for his iMac. Alas, he writes, I did not record the recovery key for this encryption as I thought it would be much easier to save the encryption password in the secure place rather than save the much longer recovery key. Does saving the recovery key have more benefit than saving the password? And if so, what is the extra benefit? And he goes on to ask, if it is better to save the recovery key rather than the password, is there anything I can now do to find out what my recovery key was?
Well, Nick and I were recently on a business trip together, and I heard him shout across the room as he was reading this email. The recovery key is the most important piece of information when it comes to file vault encryption. Do not ignore it. Again, do not ignore it. You need to print it out and keep the recovery key in a secure place, such as a safe deposit box at your bank or a safe just somewhere where you have it. If you forgot your password for any reason, or you're incapacitated, or a family member needs to access your files without your password, the recovery key is the only thing that will work. Otherwise, your files are locked forever and essentially gone for good. We do have some good news for Paul, however. Since he knows his password, he just needs to authenticate and disable FileVault. Once FileVault has been disabled, he can re-enable it, at which time a new recovery key will be generated, which he should be able to keep in a safe place this time. The downside here is that he'll have to wait for FileVault to re-encrypt all of his files, which could take a while. The upside is that he thought to double check on a situation before disaster struck.
It never even occurred to me that you could just do that over again if you did lose your recovery key. And I say just do that over again because, as you point out, depending on how much information you have already, it'll take a while to re-encrypt it. But, I mean, it is good to know that, yeah, if you've lost that, if you know you've lost that before you need it, you can go back and recover a recovery key.
Exactly. And technically, when I was doing some research on this, and I thought that it would work that way. I wanted to make sure. You also could technically contact Apple if you don't have your recovery key. And, you know, they say we can't even recover your data, but they have some tools and stuff that they did in the past that could help unlock locked Macs. So it might be in your best interest is to double check with them if you're in a situation where you don't have the password or the recovery key. But yeah, right now, if you have FileVault enabled on your computer and you don't have your recovery key, go ahead and disable it and re-enable it so you can get a recovery key. Because if anything ever happens and you don't have that recovery key, that's not good.
Yeah, but for the most part, don't plan on anybody else being able to help you if you've lost the information, because you hear stories time and time again, whether it be from somebody who had passed away or law enforcement needed access to whatever computer files. You hear time and time again about Apple not being able to provide any sort of master unlock keys or anything like that. So,
and going an awful direction. I mean, when we say incapacitated, we actually had a discussion about this off mic. A lot of times what we're talking about is when somebody has died. And really, you do not want to be dealing with this, or you do not want your loved ones to be dealing with, oh, I have to get a certificate to this, and I have to call Apple. And, what you're going to tell Apple is, so I can't get into this computer. And that's what they're going to hear. And your reasons may be legitimate. Your trouble may be sincere. And still, you've got somebody on the other end of the phone whose job it is to keep people out of people's computers. I mean, they're not there to just open up a computer for somebody just because you say. So, I mean, even if they're able to do it, there's going to be a world of stuff you're going to have to go through just to have that happen. Better that everything's prepared ahead of time. Hey, Morbid. Let's move on to the final question on the show. Inspired by episode 30, the one about the cloud. Eric wrote in asking about optimized storage. I'm assuming Time Machine is smart enough to understand the stub files, he writes. So if a file is removed from my Mac's SSD and replaced with a stub, Time Machine will retain a full backup of that file. Also wondering if I update an iCloud file on another device, and that file is currently a stub on my Mac, does Time Machine know to download a new copy of the file to back up?
Well, unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of information on this topic out there. There are a whole lot of people asking the same question. So this is definitely a point that would be nice to have Apple clarify. But as far as we can tell, if Time Machine had previously backed up your file prior to it being optimized and turning into a stub file, it will retain the full backup of that file for a certain period of time. After your Time Machine backup uses up a certain amount of space, it gets too large, it starts cycling out the oldest backups and overwriting them. That's normal behavior with Time Machine. Essentially is if you run out of disk space, it gets rid of the oldest stuff first because it figures you don't need it anymore. So after optimized storage has taken place on your Mac and that file is now in the cloud and it's only existing as a stub file on your Mac, Time Machine will only be backing up the stub file of the file. To restore the original file in all its glory, say if you accidentally removed it from iCloud and it's gone, you'd need to know the exact time and date that optimized storage took place on your Mac. You'd need to go that far back and then a little bit more in Time Machine to restore the original. Again, after a certain amount of time, that original backup will be overwritten and the file will be effectively lost forever. Again, assuming that it's out of iCloud at this point. Since Time Machine is only backing up the stub file after optimized storage has taken place, if you make changes on another device, for example, in iCloud, it wouldn't have any effect. Time Machine would still only be backing up the stub file. Again, it would be nice if Apple could clarify the situation here, because it does seem like a bit of a disaster waiting to happen if, you thought you had it backed up and you're like, oh, I can delete it from iCloud now because it's on my Time Machine, and your Time Machine didn't really have the whole file. So, this is one of those ones where got to kind of be careful with the optimized storage. And I believe you can set some limits on what kind of stuff it's optimizing and removing from your Mac. But this might be a situation too where you want to have that second backup. It's maybe not even a Time Machine backup. Maybe you're physically dragging files, really important files, to another external hard drive just in case, because something goes wrong with the cloud, something goes wrong with your backup. You don't want to be in a situation where you're missing those critical files.
If you missed any of the answers to any of today's questions, or if you missed any of the questions and don't know what we were answering, well, you can find all of that and more for the show notes for this show, and that's online at securemac.com/checklist. That's notes for this show as well as previous and future episodes, and it's also a good site for friends and family members who could maybe use a little security help, because not only do we have the notes there, but we have past episodes you can listen to as well. securemac.com/checklist. Would you like to be part of the Q&A, the next one? Q&A Part 3, let's call it? Well, emailing us is the way to start that. Checklist@securemac.com is the email address. That again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.